everyone, welcome to this second lecture video. The focus of this video is on patristic theology. So what do we mean by patristic? Well, patristic is the word for father. So it speaks to the church fathers, some of the early Christians that began to establish some of the doctrinal beliefs. Now, we should also talk about the church fathers and mothers. Even though the word patristic gets used, it's important to recognize the contributions of women early on in the history of the church and in the history of theology. So as we dig into patristic theology, it's important to recognize some of the linguistic and philosophical tools that they used. So as we talked last time about Charles Taylor and social imaginary, it's important to recognize how the cultural world that we inhabit makes certain beliefs possible and maybe closes off certain beliefs. So there's certain ways of talking about God and faith. So we can see this when we look at probably the most important creed in Christianity. It's kind of what makes us Christian, the Nicene Creed. So as you go through the creed, here it is. We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. It starts very similar to the Apostles' Creed, which was a baptismal creed early on, and we'll talk about that a little later. But you get to this middle piece here where they're talking about the person of Jesus Christ. And it says, "And the one Lord Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, begotten from the Father before all ages, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, of the same essence as the Father." The word that's used there is homoousios. Now again, that word, of the same essence, sets Christianity on a trajectory. This is the early church trying to give language to what they believe about this person named Jesus. And so if you think about it this way, they're taking the biblical narrative and they're taking the biblical revelation about who Jesus is, and they're now wrestling with what does it mean to say that Jesus is fully divine or fully God. We'll talk about the Nicene Creed later in the Council of Nicaea and what it is that they were doing. But here is just an example of how language becomes important as we think about the foundations of Christian theology. Now, this may seem strange, but to really get into some of this patristic stuff, we need to talk about the philosopher Plato and get into this philosophical world of epistemology. How is it that we know anything? How is it that our language makes sense of the world? So I have some trees, pictures of trees here. And what I normally do in a classroom is I'll say to the students, all right, what do you see? And they'll all say, well, they're trees. And I'll say, well, how do you know that they're trees? And usually they'll say, well, somebody taught us. Or you can tell by the green and the trunk, and they'll start describing the tree. But what's significant about this is that all of these things are different. You have some trees that shed their leaves in the fall. You have some trees that are evergreen. You have some trees that live in drier climates. They all look different. Yet, when we see this picture or we look out into the world and we see these things, we say these are trees. So the question then is, well, how do we know? What is the relationship between this word tree, or you could put it in a different language if you'd like, the idea or the concept of treeness and this physical thing that is out there in the world? And this is what Plato really kind of wrestled with. And many of you are probably familiar with Plato's allegory of the cave, where he talks about how these humans have been enslaved and they're looking against a wall, and here you can see that there's somebody else behind another wall that's behind them with a puppet, and it's casting a shadow onto the wall because there's a fire, and these people who are stuck are watching the wall. These people who have been enslaved and chained are watching the wall. And they believe that the shadow world is the real world. They don't know anything else. And so what Plato's allegory of the cave talks about is how somebody breaks free and they end up getting up out of the cave and going into the sunlight. and beginning to kind of see the real world. And at first, he says that person's eyes are going to be blinded, they're going to not know what's going on, but then their eyes begin to adjust, and they see the world that they've lived in, they thought was real, was really not the most real thing. Now then he says that this person will go back into the cave, try to tell everybody, but because he goes back into darkness, this person will stumble around, and they'll look foolish, and everybody will laugh at them and not believe them. But what he's doing is he's talking about knowledge and wisdom. What is the foundation of true wisdom? And he believes that we humans are living in a shadow world. We look at this material world and we think this is the most real thing. And what Plato wants us to see is that there is another world, that there's another reality that is much more real and becomes the basis of this material reality. And so as you think about Plato's ontology, or an ontology is kind of thinking about being and what is the world, what is reality. What he does is he separates the eternal from the temporal. Now, throughout this course, you're going to hear me talk about this. That as we think about this spiritual world or this eternal world, it's different, it's higher, it's a different realm than this material world in which we live. And the question then will be, how do they relate to one another? And it's the connection between them that Plato will argue gives us the foundation for knowledge and gives us the foundation for wisdom. So when you talk about, for example, a tree, what he would argue is that within this eternal world, within this spiritual world, there exists a form of treeness, which is the ideal, and that this ideal becomes the basis for every material tree. And when we ask the question about, well, what makes a tree good or bad? What's a good tree? What's a bad tree? Plato would say we can make that claim based upon the fact that there exists a real treeness that had become the basis for all of these different material trees. And that these different trees in the world measure up more or less to this ideal treeness. Now, what Plato would also want us to say is that as we move away from the spiritual or the form of treeness, we move to stuff that is less real. Now, what he means by that is not that it doesn't exist, but it's like heat, a source of heat. Right near the heat, it's very hot, but then the heat dissipates as it moves outward. And it's the same thing. So why in this material world is there change and corruption? And why do some trees become distorted? And Plato is saying that the further we can move away from that ideal, that is where we get corruption. So think about it in these terms. The cave then is the material world that we have taken to be the highest reality. And Plato is arguing that no, there is a reality that is higher than that, upon which this material world is based. And so when you think about the forms for Plato, there's humanness, dogness, catness, whatever. The highest is the good and justice and some of those terms. But he puts the good as the highest, almost that which is kind of beyond, in a sense, beyond this hierarchy. And then you move from that good into the forms, down into the material world. Now, the question for Plato is going to be, how then does knowledge work? And you have to understand that for Plato, to get connected into this kind of spiritual reality, we do that through reason. And so he sees the human person as kind of being split into these three different parts. You have the rational, you have the spirit, and then you have kind of the appetites. And he uses the charioteer analogy to talk about the role of reason, and that the soul becomes that place, the seat of reason, to where our mind can connect to the forms and make sense of the world in its connection to these forms. And so you see this picture of the charioteer. If you have these two horses, which is the spirit and appetites, if they just go off in their own directions and they're not being controlled, it's not going to be a good thing. And so what happens is reason becomes kind of the charioteer that is disciplining, that is keeping the spirit and the appetites under control so that the chariot can move in the right direction. And so what we're going to begin to see, especially when we read Augustine, is this idea of being rightly ordered. What does it mean to be rightly ordered? Plato certainly recognizes that to be a human person means to have reason and to be material. But the reason needs to control the material, because the reason and the mind connects, the rational connects to those higher higher forms. And so this is how Plato understands kind of epistemology. He sees nature as being, or the nature of reality as being consisting of a higher and a lower, a spiritual and a material. Reason is part of that higher world, and it's through reason and our soul that we're able to connect to that higher world. And then our bodies, our passions, our emotions are a part of kind of the material, the changing world that becomes less real. So think about the higher realm as the eternal, the unchanging, the forms, and the lower realm in which we experience time and in which we talk about the body, the passions, and we talk about change. Now, this isn't the important point that I need to make here, because some of you might be thinking, what does this have to do with theology? One of the things that's important is to recognize how the spiritual, the forms, participate in the material. So this notion of participation is a recognition that the spiritual has now become embedded within the material, and that our knowledge of the material world comes from our connection to and its participation in those higher forms. What's important also to recognize is that for Plato, these forms have an existence of their own, that they are real, they exist, they are not just in our mind, but that our mind is kind of resonating with these things that really exist, that then give form and shape to the material world. This is what we'll call realism. There really is this other reality out there. There is a treeness, a humanness, these ideals, these kind of spiritual forms, and the world that we inhabit resonates with that higher reality. All right, why am I talking about this? This becomes the basis upon which theology gets done in the patristic period. Greek philosophy, Platonic philosophy, and other forms as well, but Plato really early on provides the philosophical tools and the language and the categories that the church uses to begin to try to make sense of Christianity, who God is, and begin to articulate certain theological beliefs. I want to make clear here, I'm not saying we should reduce the theological beliefs that they had to Greek philosophy, but it's a recognition of the ways in which they tried to make sense of the biblical revelation of who God is. We are doing the same thing in our own contemporary world. We may not realize it, but we have been influenced by certain perspectives and certain language, and we use that language then to make sense of our own faith. It doesn't mean we reduce faith to those categories, but it's always a recognition that these categories are the tools that we use to try to articulate what it is that we believe and who God is. So we'll see as we go through here, especially as we talk about Augustine, that and one of the questions that I want to ask is Augustine a Platonist? He's certainly influenced by Platonic philosophy, but does that necessarily mean that his theology is just merely kind of Platonic philosophy? So we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about how these theological ideas and these terms become grounded in the philosophical tools of the Greeks and Plato specifically. We're also then going to see as we progress how though that language will shift. So there'll be a shift from the patristic period with Plato to the medieval period with Aristotle. And then to understand how in the Reformation what you're getting is pushback against some of the philosophical tools that are being used to try to do theology. So in the next lecture, what we'll pick up with is we'll begin looking specifically at some of the Christian beliefs, some of the early Christian creeds, and begin to push into some of the thinkers like Augustine.